First day of Sunday school. But I invite all the adults to continue to come. We're still going to do the adult Bible study too. Because I think we're getting some good things in that. We talked a little bit about, we're still in Genesis, but now Genesis and how it relates to Exodus. And we begin today with our reading in Exodus with the institution of the first Passover. And the Passover in the Old Testament is at the heart of the Exodus experience. And the Exodus experience, as I mentioned before, just about the biggest historical event of all time. It's the event from which all else follows. And this first Passover creates an annual, historical touchstone. It reminds every generation in the thousands of years since that God liberated his people. The description of the ritual, it offers us a specific promise that we too will be delivered, that we will be liberated. We will be liberated, and this promise is bound to the concrete reality of the Lamb's blood as God keeps his promises. God always keeps his promises to his people. Yet it is here, in instituting the Passover, that God summons the Israelites to the work of liturgy, of ritual, of remembrance. This is what always interests me, and Exodus is a great book for this as well, because we see it here, but we also see it at the end. God gives very, very detailed instructions about exactly what he wants done. And at the end, when God wants the tabernacle built, he gives very, very detailed instructions for these observances. And after the event, after this first Passover, we get even more guidelines established. So God is very detailed in what he commands. Every spring from now on, in the first month of the 14th day of the month, each household is to set aside a kid, a goat or a sheep. Butcher it, roast it, eat it. Eat it with haste. You eat it with your loins girded, with your sandals on, with your staff in hand. That's just a bit. Now you have to roast it, the head and legs and everything's still going to be on it. You don't let any go. These are very, very detailed instructions. I said it's almost something like out of the military. God breaks it down Barney style. You do it by the numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, onward and upward. They're incredibly detailed instructions. They're seemingly mundane commands, but God has given it to his people. He's commanding it, and God is not explaining his commands. He doesn't say, oh, this is going to symbolize this and this and this and this. That's for you to figure out later. God's given you a command, you do it because he's God. You obey. First you obey God, like Abraham, our father of faith. So first we obey God. Then later we take the time, we ponder, we interpret, we try to derive meanings, deeper meanings from these things. But we are to obey God because we owe him obedience. But God's commands, despite being so detailed and seemingly all over the place, God's commands are not arbitrary. Indeed, when we read through the commands today in Exodus, what you'll notice is everything God commands is a positive command. God says, do this. God says, do that. Yet in Romans, when we hear from Paul, God's commands are presented in mainly a negative form. Thou shalt not. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not kill, steal, bear false witness, not covet. Although Paul, too, does not fail to show that these negative commands are part of the greatest positive commandment. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Yet here, we have to ask, what's the common thread running through this? What do these commandments, both the positive and negative, what do they mean? What are they meant to do? And the answer in Paul's epistle is really clear. We're to refrain from doing stuff like committing adultery, murdering, stealing, coveting, and all the rest out of love for our neighbor. if you love your neighbor, for he that loveth hath fulfilled the law. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. So the reason we don't do things like fool around with somebody else's spouse is because that's not very loving to our neighbor. That's why we cast off the works of darkness. We put on the armor of light. We walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, nor in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying to fill the lust of the flesh. Because refraining from these types of behavior, this kind of antisocial thing, these sins, they're not a deprivation of our lust. They're not a deprivation of what we want to do. Interestingly, this is the text that when Augustine was told, Tolle lege, take and read, this is the text that converted St. Augustine. He said, no, I'm not to be out rioting and drunkenness and fornicating and doing this and that. But it's not a deprivation of his lust. It's not like Augustine said, I'm being deprived of all the fun stuff I like to do. It's an amplification of his love of neighbor. You don't do these things because you're hurting other people. And that's basic. I probably didn't even need to explain why we should avoid sins like those. Why thou shalt not kill, steal, stuff like that. I shouldn't even really have to explain that. But what about God's positive commandments? Where he's telling us to actually do things, to do positive things. Not just to avoid doing negative things, but actually to do good and positive things. Do we really have to pay attention to all these seemingly liturgical and ritual commands? Or is God really, he doesn't care about all those rituals. He's just some big bearded moralizing boss in the sky that tells you, do this and don't do that, and you just listen. His main concern in life is just, with your bourgeois morality. I don't think so. The answer to this question is very important, though, because how we answer it, this shapes how we view life. If you view God as his big, bearded, moralizing boss in the sky, then you're most likely going to live in fear. And you're going to avoid doing wrong things. You're going to avoid sin, but mostly out of fear. If you see God as saying, okay, he's given me these strange commandments, all these liturgical commandments, ritual commandments, that don't seem to make a lot of sense at first, but they must have some meaning, then you're going to live in hope. You're going to rejoice in freedom. You're going to live without fear of sin, because you're not just avoiding the bad. You're not avoiding sin. You're trying to do the good. And what are these positive commands? What are they good for? Does it really matter that we slaughter the goat this way? Does it really matter that the tabernacle is built this way? Does it really matter when we come together on a Sunday that we follow this liturgy? Does it really matter? I said it does. But we can see in Exodus that these positive commandments, these liturgical commandments, are there for one reason and one reason only. To bring people into relationships with each other. The Passover is instituted to form a holy community. It's formed, it's instituted to create his people, to unite his people around a feast, around a memory. And even today, like I said, thousands of years later, the Jewish people still celebrate and remember being freed from bondage in Egypt. You keep it as an ordinance forever. To keep an ordinance, to obey these positive commands, to come and do liturgical worship, is to confess the faith. It is to trust the one who delivered Israel from oppression and tyranny, and to trust that he'll do it again. It is not simply to trust God to make life easy, or to give you boons in the afterlife, a little pie in the sky when you die. It is trusting that God is here right now, that God is here to lead each and every one of us out of bondage. And make no mistake, we're all in bondage. That's where the negative commandments come in. Are you in bondage to various lusts of the flesh? Are you in bondage to greed, the worship of mammon? Are you in bondage to hatred of your brothers and sisters? Are you in bondage to your own high opinion of yourself? Are you in bondage to some kind of ideology that shapes the way you think? Are you in a very material sense? Are you in bondage to abuse on the part of someone else? Are you in bondage to debt, to financial insecurity? Are you in bondage to poverty? We're all in bondage to something. That's the human condition. We're all in bondage at the very least, to sin and death. But we have God as a liberator. We have God's kingdom as our destination. We have God's kingdom as where we're being led to. And we are working together, or at least we should be. We're working together as a community to be free. Free at last. So God's commandments, both the positive and the negative, they're centered around one thing and one thing only: bringing us together. Creating a community. Establishing relationships to do this liberating work. Establishing relationships to help build His kingdom. Thus, it's not surprising in today's gospel, Jesus talks about reproving sinners. Because if God's commandments, negative and positive, are all about bringing us into relation, bringing us together, what is sin? Sin is that what tears us apart. So Jesus talks about reproving sinners. And make no mistake, Jesus says that reproving sinners is a duty. It's not an option. The problem with how we approach reproving sinners is a lot of us Christians, we really dig that part where we get to call other folks out and say, you're a sinner, a witch, a heretic. We dig that. But we don't dig that other part. Let's repair relationships. Let's reconcile. Let's build. Jesus is not here when he says to reprove sinners, saying go castigate your brother who sins against you, or go snitch him out to the church. Let's go drop dimes on him. Some people read it that way. That ain't the way it is. Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. Go. First thing, if somebody sins against you, not somebody has a particular moral failing that you don't like, that you want to go call them out, but somebody did something to you that bothers you, that sinned against you. You go to him or her, you work it out amongst yourselves. Just like you would in a family. Brothers and sisters fighting, stop fighting, go work it out amongst yourselves. Don't bicker, talk it out, come to understand exactly what caused this trespass. And it might be a big misunderstanding. Maybe the person never really trespassed against you. Maybe you took something the wrong way. But work it out first among yourselves. So no castigating anybody, no judgment. But if he will not hear thee, then take with thee one or two more, and in the mouth of two or three witnesses every word may be established. If you can't clear it up together, bring in a few trustworthy friends. Bring in a few trustworthy Christians. Not to gang up on the other. No, you did this to me, this was wrong, and I got two or three of my buddies, and they're going to yell at you too. That's not what it's about. But so that they can see that you're making an effort to reconcile. And those two or three friends, again, might see something you two don't see. And they may help to mend that relationship, to bring you back together. And after all of this, after these good faith efforts all fail, then you call in the church. Essentially do the same job as the friends. So you bring in the whole church and say, come on, let's bring us together. Let's reconcile the party. And as I said, notice the sin we're reproving here is a sin that has broken a relationship. So in that if somebody did something to somebody else that breaks a relationship. Like I said, it's not a particular moral failing. You don't get to just go and critique everybody, because you do that, first critique yourself. Oh, you like this thing. Oh, you gamble a little too much. Oh, you do this. Oh, you have too many drinks on Friday. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about things that impair relationships. And then finally, if he neglects even to hear the church, let him be unto thee as a heathen man and a publican. So only after all else fails, and someone who has clearly sinned against somebody else, then the church finally will recognize him as a heathen man and a publican. Well, how did Jesus treat the heathens and the publicans? He was open to them, still had faith, still ate with them. Sinners and tax collectors. So even in that, sounds pretty rough, but even Jesus treated the heathens and the publicans well. So here we see that reproving sinners is not what we often think it is. It's not about going out and taking it upon ourselves to inform everybody of their own particular moral failings. That's what we like to do. That's called judgmental. That's called being a jerk. Really. Reproving sinners, just like those positive and negative commandments of God, is done with an aim of reestablishing relationships. Reestablishing relationships among all of us as children of God, to the praise and glory of God's name, because God is present in the needs of our neighbors, regardless of their moral status. And that's a hard thing a lot of folks don't understand. We talked about this in Bible study today. God picked the people of Israel to be his people. Was it because they were morally superior? I don't think so. Read the book. Nearly every king of Israel was a wicked king. The people of Israel were stiff-necked, turned away from God all the time. God picked Israel as his people, but he didn't pick it because they deserved it. Likewise, God picked the poor, the marginal, the oppressed, the lowest of the low, the publicans, the heathens, and the tax collectors and sinners. That's who Jesus came amongst. Why? Did he pick the poor because the poor are morally superior? Or the poor have merit? Or the poor are somehow better than the rich? No. He picked them because he could show his justice through them. And because the poor are poor. And their needs dictate the rest of us. I came to bring good news to the poor, sight to the blind, to free the captives. It doesn't say because if I do that, the poor will be good, the blind will be good. It doesn't matter. We're there because of their needs, not their moral status. God doesn't choose people on the basis of their bourgeois morality. He doesn't choose who he loves on the basis of our charitable works. We're not saved by works, we're saved by faith. Instead, God reveals himself to a marginal people with wicked leaders. Likewise, God explicitly sent the gospel to the poor just because they're poor. Just because they're disinherited. Just because they're weak. It's through these communities, not individuals, that God demonstrates justice. And ultimately, just as the commandments, positive and negative, are about establishing relationships, the gospel is about community. It's not an individual sport. You don't do it alone. Salvation is an individual. I say unto you that if two of you shall agree on earth as touching anything that they shall ask, it shall be done for them of my Father which is in heaven. Two of you agree. For where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. God's commandments, the reason we don't want to sin, is because God's commandments are about bringing us close together. It's about bringing 2, 3, 4, 5 onward together to build this kingdom. Together to do his work. Anything that takes us apart is a sin. So when we're being taken apart, reprove that sinner, but reprove him or her in the way that we're taught. Not moralizing, not judging, not saying we're better than anybody, but saying, let's reconcile. Let's bring ourselves together. Let's bring ourselves together to build this kingdom. That's the gospel. That's what we're being taught. Let us pray. Divine Judge, you framed the earth with love and mercy. You declared it good. Yet we, desiring to justify ourselves, we judge others harshly, often without knowledge or understanding. Keep us faithful in prayer that we may be filled with the knowledge of your will and not ignore or pass by the needs of others, but to plumb the depths of love in showing mercy. Amen.